Well, thanks so much for having me on. Um, I'm so pleased to talk with you because, as you'll see, the whole key to this is that we work together. We got into this mess because childhood norms changed over the last 20 or 30 years in ways that are really impeding human development and education. And we have a chance to change them back this year. Things can change very, very quickly if we act together, and private schools have
On
much
a
more
Zoom call.
flexibility than public schools do to affect change. And if a group of private schools work together and come up with some general things that they're doing together, I think that would be really inspiring. It'll really lay out a path for schools all around the country. And actually, this is a global phenomenon, so all around the world. So let me tell you about what's going on and what I learned while writing The Anxious Generation. This is the outline of my talk, and I'm going to start by talking about the global destruction of human capital that has occurred since 2012. So I'll start with the education data. A few months ago, Derek Thompson wrote an article in The Atlantic titled, "It Sure Looks Like the Phones Are Making Students Dumber." And what he was referring to is that we have good data on educational progress. And the NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the nation's report card, it showed, you can see here in the graphs, we made slow but steady progress. They're not, increases are not large, but they were steady since the 1970s. So we've been making American students gradually, slowly, it's a lot of work, but we've been raising those numbers. And then what happens? Well, what happens is that the numbers drop. And everybody says, oh my God, COVID was terrible. And it was. Keeping kids out of school, making them stay on devices was terrible for education. But guess what? The scores turned around not in 2020, but in 2012. American education started being less effective in 2012. And we are now most of the way back to where we were in 1971. So that's the US. Well, it turns out this is happening globally. So the PISA study, which is the world's only real educational assessment, finds the same thing. These were the scores in math, reading, and science up until 2010. And then look what happens. In this period of 2010 to 2015 is when everything changes and test scores are plummeting around the world. Jean Twenge and I took the PISA data set, which is all about academic achievement, but they have embedded within it 6 questions that are about loneliness at school, engagement in school. So one of the items is, I feel lonely at school. I often feel lonely at school. Do you agree, disagree? So you average these 6 items together, and what you see is that from 2000 to 2012, no change. Nothing was changing in any of the regions that PISA covers. But what happens after 2012? All around the world, except maybe Asia, that's very small, but in all the other regions, and especially the English-speaking countries, students are lonelier because you come to school, everyone's on devices, you're not talking with your friends, you're not laughing, you're not joking as much as you did in 2010. And so many of you might have seen this article in the Wall Street Journal a week or two ago. A teacher did all he could to keep kids off phones, and he's quitting in frustration. And the author of the article says, dozens of teachers have told me they spend more time policing kids' phone use than they do teaching. For Rutherford, who's the focus of the article, who once embraced technology, seeing kids checked out and, in his view, addicted, robbed him of the joy of teaching. Now, he tried all sorts of things. One thing, he tried to get the kids to do a week-long detox, to not use their phones for a week. And a few of the kids did it. One who stuck with it said this. Before the detox, Isabel Ritchie, a senior in his AP biology class, was spending 6 hours a day on her phone, most of it watching TikTok. I would go on my phone at the beginning of every class and never get off, she says. If a lot of kids, if it's only 10 or 20% even, are watching TikTok during class, of course we're going to see a global decline in education, in human capital. So, but she stuck with it. And now she's down to about an hour a day and has read 9 novels since starting the detox. She's also been doing homework in long chunks without breaking to watch TikTok every 10 minutes. She's in a better mood and feels less stressed. I'm finding the exact same thing with my students at NYU. I get them to regain control of their attention, greatly reduce their time on social media. And they say, it's amazing. I can sit down and do my homework and I actually finish it in an hour. So it's just unbelievable that we let kids have access to phones and the entire internet during class. it's getting so bad that eyeballs are changing. This article just appeared in Nature a few days ago, all around the world, because kids are spending so much time holding a screen close to them. Television at least was a few feet away, but a screen is so close to them that human eyeballs in Gen Z and Gen Alpha are getting longer, which means they're short-sighted. But but there's an easy solution. More outdoor activities, more recess, get the kids outdoors more, and that actually helps them develop healthy eyeballs. So my point is, I'm going to talk about the mental health crisis, which is what most of this debate, most of this discussion is on. But within the broader context of education, we're seeing a global destruction of human intelligence, human capability, human possibility, human capital since 2012. So now let's zoom in on the mental health, which is where we see the most devastation. So I got into this when I wrote The Coddling of the American Mind with my friend Greg Lukianoff, because the students coming into universities in 2014, 2015 were really different from those that we knew in 2012. And you can see that here. So this is nationally representative data from UCLA's Harry Higher Education Research. In 2012, all the students were millennials. There were no Gen Z. Gen Z is 1996 birth year and later. Everyone was a millennial, and those were the levels of various disabilities. What happens as Gen Z arrives on campus? It's psychological disorders that goes up. That's the big difference between the millennials and Gen Z, is that Gen Z has very, very high levels of anxiety, depression, self-harm, and suicide compared to the millennial generation. Now, it's not all disorders. It's overwhelmingly anxiety and depression. What you see here are graphs of the percentage of US undergraduates who are diagnosed with particular disorders. And what you'll see in this graph and the ones coming is no change before 2010. In 2010, everything looks fine. And by 2015, all hell breaks loose and things are terrible. So here's what happens after 2010. Levels of everything goes up, but anxiety and depression rise from had been about 10% of all students to now the point, where if we're up at 24%, 20%, you put the two together, something like a third of our students now have one of these major disorders. It's just normal. And it's not that everyone is developing this, it's only young people. So here's national data, not college students, national data broken up by age. What you can see again, no change before 2010, and then this happens. For the older people in green, people over 50, no change at all. For millennials in red, ages 26 to 34, at the end of that data set, they do go up somewhat. The younger millennials, you see a little bit of this, but it's really concentrated in Gen Z. If you're an American born after 1996, you have a much higher chance of being anxious and depressed than any previous generation that we know in history. And there are all kinds of powerful gender differences. If we look at rates of depression, we see this. Girls have higher rates of depression and anxiety, especially during the beginning of puberty. And then in the period we're talking about, both of them go up. And as a relative increase, they're actually in the same ballpark. But girls start off at a higher level. So it is, again, it's just a normal part of being an American girl is that you're depressed. It's very, very common now. And I just want you to notice the 2021 measure was during COVID. So you can see the COVID effect there, but it's tiny. Whatever was happening in the early 2010s is many times greater than the entire COVID epidemic. And it's not just self-report. Some of my critics say, oh, it's just, the students are happy saying that they're depressed, but it's not really a change from previous generations. No, because we see the same thing in behavior that is not self-reported. So this is the number out of 100,000 that are, actually, these are emergency room visits for non-fatal self-harm for 10 to 14-year-olds. What you see is, again, this pattern. Now here, it's really just the girls that are going up a lot. And self-harm even among younger teenage girls is now common. It didn't used to be common. It used to be much restricted to older teen girls. And tragically, we see the same thing with suicides. Again, no trend before 2010, and then this happens. And especially when we look at the younger girls, the early puberty for girls, that's where the most damage is done. What do we see? In a single year, it's as though someone flipped a light switch in 2012, and we get a 67% increase in suicides. And that wasn't just a blip, a data aberration. It was on its way up to 134% increase. And it's not just us. This is when I began to realize whoa, I can't go on with my other work. I have to focus on this because this is a global epidemic. The same thing is happening at the same time all over the developed world. We don't have good data from the developing world, but at least we know that it is happening across the developed world. Here's just a little bit of data from the UK. This is self-harm rates in the UK, same pattern as the US. Huge increase in the early 2010s. Something happened in the early 2010s. And psychiatric emergency department visits among Australian teens, same thing. Something happened, and especially girls around the world, around the developed world, start checking into psychiatric emergency wards. So that's the mystery. Why are young people becoming more anxious, depressed, and lonely? Why are they more likely to harm and kill themselves? And with the biggest increases in the younger teen girls. Why are human beings becoming less educated, less able to focus, and hence functionally less intelligent? It's as though IQ is dropping because young people can't deploy their intelligence to do something. They're too distracted. Well, I guess I just gave away the answer. It's no surprise. So let's move on to the answer. I have a giant Google Doc where I keep every possible alternative explanation that people have proposed to me. Oh, it's school shootings. Oh, it's air pollution. Oh, it's plastics in the water. It's something. And no, none of them fit the timing and the international scope other than the great rewiring theory. And so the story that I tell in my book is a tragedy in two acts. In Act One, we jettison the play-based childhood. For millions of years, human children have played outside, played with each other. That's how we wire up our brains. So we get rid of play, outdoor unsupervised play, from 1980 to 2010. That's Act One of the tragedy, and that sets us up for Act Two, which is the birth of the phone-based childhood, which happens in the blink of an eye. Between 2010 and 2015, we have an extraordinary rewiring of human childhood, of what it means to be a child, of what your daily life is like. So just to give an example, childhood, we think of it as being full of fun and adventure and a little bit of risk. These kids could get hurt on this seesaw, and that's part of what makes it exciting. This is the one book that is consistently above The Anxious Generation on the Amazon sales chart. This is like one of the most sold books in the country for years and years. And it might have been true when it was written, but now it's a giant lie. It's just not true. We should have the Dr. Seuss estate change the title to "Oh, the Places You'll Never Go Because We're Too Afraid and We Will Not Let You Go There" by Dr. Seuss. So this is no longer what childhood is about. Now childhood is if you let your 8-year-old walk a few blocks and a neighbor calls the police, you could go to jail, or at least the police will call Child Protective Services, and now you're being investigated for years as an irresponsible parent for having neglected your child. So as we freak out about child abduction and we get so afraid of any child ever being outside without a chaperone, without a guard, at the same time, the internet comes in so that kids have a lot of fun stuff to do at home. So this is a graph of how quickly Americans adopted various technologies. And you can see that there's always a decade in which everyone is adopting a technology. And the first wave of the internet was amazing. Many of you on the call remember what it was like in the early 90s, as when we first got the internet in the mid 90s. And it was like God came down and said, "Hey, do you want omniscience? Here you go." And our kids went on it. The millennials grew up with it, and they're fine. The early internet was amazing. It didn't make kids sick. Then we get the second wave, social media and the smartphone. The iPhone, of course, introduced in 2007, Facebook, things like that, are around 2003, 2004. This is the fastest technology adoption in human history. And in the blink of an eye, childhood changes in this second wave. And in the blink of that same eye, the girls begin getting depressed and anxious. The boys' story is they're also doing badly, but I'll get to that in a moment. So this great rewiring, we had children used to have outdoor adventures. In the bottom left, you see a typical scene from the 1980s where children bike around their neighborhood with an extraterrestrial in the basket, because that was, you could do that back then. Like, kids had a lot of autonomy. But that's not what childhood is anymore. Now it's this. If you're a boy, you have to go home alone. Otherwise, you can't play with your friends. You need your controller, your screen, your headset. And if you're a girl, everything's happening on social media and on the phone. So, you go home and you're just on the phone. I can prove to you how this changed when we look at how much time young people spend with their friends. So this is a graph of how Americans of all ages spend their time, like minute by minute. And what you see is that how much time do you spend with friends? Well, if you're in the youngest group, 15 to 24, you spend a lot of time with your friends. It used to be 2 hours a day. Older people, they're married, they have jobs, they're not hanging out with their friends like on the TV show Friends. But what happens after 2012? Once everyone has a smartphone, this is what happens. Time with friends plunges. Now, note, it doesn't go down very much for the older generations until the very end, because 2019 is before COVID. 2020, that data collection was after COVID. And if you look closely, can you see the COVID effect on young people? You can see it on the older people. You see how the lines get sharper, the drop gets sharper among older people. But among Gen Z, it's no acceleration. Gen Z was rapidly social distancing from 2012 through 2019. And in 2020, they just went a little further and became socially distanced. And even when they're together, even that's an overestimate, because even when they're together, they're often not really interacting. It's not just when they're teenagers. We give our kids screens, multiple screens. Here's a little boy. His father was very proud. He posted this on TikTok. Look at the kid go. Look at that. Now imagine this boy's brain getting this level of stimulation for 6 hours a day for the next 10, 15, 20 years. This has to have an effect. We don't even wait for them to be 3 or 4. If you bring your kid to soccer practice and you're coaching your older son, well, just give your daughter your iPhone and then you'll be able to coach the soccer game because you'll keep her quiet. And if you have a 1-year-old in daycare, give them a phone so they can be just like mama, at least a toy phone. So in this brief talk, I'm not going to go through all the harms, all the things that have happened to Gen Z. I'll just list them, and that's going to take a while. So you can just read this for yourself. But when our kids start spending 7 to 9 hours a day, which is the average, on their phones, 5 hours a day of that is just social media. But 7 to 9 hours, the general estimates, not including school and homework. What else happens? Well, social deprivation, as I already showed you. So kids are not spending much time with other kids as they used to. Sleep deprivation, sleep suffers, they sleep less, which has a variety of physical and psychological effects. You get attention fragmentation. Kids have a lot more trouble staying on a task. A lot of Gen Z find it difficult to look at just one screen. They'll often have 2 screens going because they need a higher level of stimulation. And behavioral addiction. Most boys are not addicted to video games, but about 2 to 10% are. And for them, the damage can be quite severe over time, over many years. So these are the foundational harms that hit boys and girls. Now, I have a whole chapter in the book on all the harms that hit girls because social media is especially bad for girls. It lures them in with the promise of understanding relationships and learning information, and it traps them there because once they're in, they can't leave because everyone else is in there. So, I'll just read visual social comparison, perfectionism, relational aggression. Girls share emotions more than boys do. They're more susceptible to sociogenic transmission. They take on each other's emotions. Girls are more subject to sexual predation and harassment. Time online means you're going to be approached by strange men who want to have sex with you, or at least get a photo of you in a bathing suit. The boys' story is a little different. It took us a little longer to figure it out. For boys, it's not like a light switch in 2012, the way it is for girls. For boys, they've been retreating from the real world since the 1970s. I recommend to you a book by Richard Reeves called Of Boys and Men. We drew on that for this chapter. But as they're spending less time in the real world, they don't care about school as much. The girls are crushing them in every level from kindergarten through PhD. Girls are crushing boys since the 70s and 80s. So the boys are withdrawing. But hey, guess what? The virtual world's getting more and more amazing. The video games are more amazing every year. The pornography is more visual, more graphic, higher speed internet every year. So the boys are getting deep into pornography and video games. And these are things that make getting satisfaction very easy without having them do anything difficult, without having them do anything that will teach them skills useful in life. And so our boys are failing to do things that would turn them into men. Right now, it looks like the girls are suffering more because they have higher rates of anxiety and depression, but more boys are going to be losers who are not gainfully employed and who are not able to find a mate. So in the long run, it might be the boys who are suffering more from this than the girls. And the net effect is that even though boys and girls come to this point by different paths, they end up in the same place. This is one of the saddest graphs in the book. This is a question on the Monitoring the Future study. I feel that my life is not very useful. How much do you agree with that? And so you ask high school students, how much do you agree with that statement on a scale, from strongly disagree to strongly agree? And only about 8% of boys and girls agreed with that up through 2011. And then this happens. Our kids are so lonely. They feel useless. They don't see a point to their lives because when you're spending your life in the virtual world, there is no point to your life. You're just providing content for others and eyeballs for advertisers, and they feel useless. No wonder they're depressed, self-harming, and suicidal. So that is the deep pit of despair, the worst part of the talk. But here's the amazing thing. We can walk out of this if we do it together. So 4 norms, and we can break the back of this problem. The key is to understand collective action problems, where if you are the only one who doesn't give your daughter an iPhone at the age of 10, let's say, or 5th grade, now your daughter says, well, Mama, I'm left out. I'm the only one. And that puts pressure on you. But if you're doing the right thing, well, it hurts and it's hard for your family. And so it might experience a net negative from that decision. But what if your daughter's not the only one? What if a quarter of the kids in class don't have an iPhone? Well, now it's not so hard. And what if 100% don't have an iPhone? Well, now everybody is better off. The kids are playing with each other. They're looking each other in the eye. They're laughing together. They're doing all the things that kids do when they don't have phones. So here are the 4 simple norms. There are so many specific ideas in the book, but there are 4 major norms that if we do these, we can break out. No smartphone before high school, no social media before 16, phone-free schools, and much more childhood independence and free play. So to go through them, I'm not saying don't give your child any kind of phone. In elementary school, if you're sending your kid out, you can give them a phone watch, a way that you can reach them. They could text you or call you if they need to. In middle school, you could give them a flip phone. That's what the millennials had, and they turned out fine. But once they have their own internet-connected device, on that day, the device is going to move to the center of their life, and it's going to stay there either for the rest of their life or until we get chip implants. And at that point, the phone will just be implanted directly into their brain. But once you give them that device, that changes their world forever and ever. So as the cartoon says, it's been so nice getting to interact with you for these past 6 years. Here's your first device. Norm number 2, no social media before 16. Social media is wildly inappropriate for minors. The amount of sex and violence, the sexual predators, the exposure to messages about drugs, gambling. As the founders of these companies, especially Facebook, they knew what they were doing. As Sean Parker put it, God only knows what it's doing to our children's brains. He said, we knew what we were doing and we did it anyway. Norm number 3, phone-free schools. So I have an article in The Atlantic. If you just look for that title, you'll find it online, where I lay out the evidence and the arguments. Because if any kids are texting during the school day, even at lunch or between classes, then everyone has to check their phones because no one wants to be left out. And this is why teachers are quitting, because they can't reach the students. The students are spending their day in the virtual world, even though they're physically in school. But it's not just the phones. Let's start with the phones. That's the easy one. We're going to have to also consider what we're doing with iPads and Chromebooks. And the reason is that the people, we should start from the assumption that when you give kids a Chromebook or an iPad that has access to the internet, we should start with the assumption that it's probably bad for them overall. And the reason is because, as we saw, the data shows that kids are learning less since 2012. And the people who made this technology, they don't want it around their kids. And so Nellie Bowles has a few articles in 2018 about what's happening in Silicon Valley. They knew, they created this stuff, and they generally send their kids to schools like the Waldorf School. They don't want their kids growing up around iPads and iPhones. A dark consensus about screens and kids begins to emerge in Silicon Valley. So this is by 2018, the people who made the technology were shunning it. Actually, Steve Jobs never let his kids have an iPad. He could see the power of it. Every school that bans phones, every school that does a true phone ban, which means you lock them up in a yonder pouch or phone locker, every school seems to have amazing results within a few weeks. All kinds of problems go down. Kids are happier. People say they hear a lot more laughter in the hallway because kids aren't just looking at their phone in between classes. And norm number 4, far more independence, responsibility, and free play in the real world. And we have a lot of ideas for you at Let Grow, letgrow.org, which I'll show you in a moment. So with those 4 norms, we can walk out of this problem. We can change things radically in the whole country within a year or 2. So what exactly can you do? And I hope this will set us up for discussion in the breakout rooms afterwards. What can schools do now, like, in the next month or two before the next school year? Well, here's what not to do. There was an article in the Washington Post about one school that they had so many mental health problems. They tried everything. Everything, really? Everything was led by adults. They had hired more therapists, more home visits, animal encounters, trauma-informed methods, social emotional learning. So adults are trying to coach and teach the kids into health. And it didn't work as far as we can tell in that article. And as far as we know from research, this is not going to really change things that much. And it costs a lot of money to do those things. But I'm very taken with this Polynesian expression that I learned from Joseph Campbell, standing on a whale, fishing for minnows. That's what we've been doing, I think, in educational contexts when we try to address mental health. Standing on a whale, fishing for minnows, because there are two giant things that we can do that will have relatively rapid effects: going phone-free and becoming playful, more play. So very briefly, I urge you all to go to anxiousgeneration.com. That's our website. We have all kinds of resources there. On the upper right, you'll see there's a Take Action button. So click Take Action. And then we have it sorted. We have actions for educators and schools, actions for parents, for legislators. We have everything. What you see here, actions for educators and schools, we have an action guide that sort of summarizes it. Here's the summary. 4 things you can do. Go phone free, which we've already talked about, and we give you links to options. More independence and free play. And this is very important. Go to Let Grow, and you'll find especially Play Club. You can keep for K-12, especially K-8, you can keep the playground open after school for a set group of kids who meet there regularly, and they form like a club, and they know each other and they play together. The Let Grow experience is our most powerful intervention at Let Grow. Kids do something independently. They get agreement from their parents that they can go 2 blocks to the store and buy milk for the first time. And they do it, and they're thrilled. And the parents are anxious. I'm telling you, you're anxious the first time you let your kid walk, your 10-year-old walk 2 blocks. But by the second time they do it, you're not anxious anymore. And you say, yeah, of course you can go out and play. Of course you can go walk to the store. And finally, you can go beyond this. You can actually send a memo to parents to try to change the norms. Oh, so I'm just zooming in here. This is just what I just showed you. Now here's the last 2, right? The Let Grow experience and send a memo to parents. So let's zoom in on that one. Right here, send a memo to parents. So in addition to communicating, as some private schools are doing now, because private schools can move much more quickly than public schools, private schools really can change rapidly this summer of 2004. And so some schools are beginning to write to the parents and really frame things. Here's why we're doing this. And they're setting themselves up. They gave me permission at the Worcester School to show this. They're setting themselves up. I don't know what they're going to do beyond this, but they're setting themselves up, as you can see. Please stay tuned for some additional opportunities for parents, students in the school to partner on this ongoing work. I'm hopeful that they will actually suggest delaying giving kids phones until high school, giving kids smartphones until high school. There's a lot that you can do because the schools can lead collective action. They can say, help us educate your kids. Here's what we need from you. So in conclusion, I believe we're suffering through a gigantic global destruction of human capital. We see it especially in the international mental health crisis. It was caused, I believe, by the great rewiring of childhood. With 4 norms, we can walk out of this if we do it together, and schools need to lead the way, because it sure looks like the phones are making students not just dumber, but lonelier and more depressed. And so rolling back the phone-based childhood, schools can, and I believe must, lead if we are to save the education and mental health of Gen Z and Gen Alpha. I hope that you will all go to anxiousgeneration.com. I hope that you will subscribe to my Substack. There's no paywall. You don't have to pay anything. This is where Zach Roush and I put out all of our research and all kinds of writing on this problem. And I hope you will especially use the resources at letgrow.org.